every time I was in that room. So the first time I was locked out of the room because somebody had broken into the psychology building at Florida State, and they had stolen all of the master keys, and they had to change the locks to all of the classrooms over the weekend. So I couldn't even get into the room to collect data from people. So I had to stand outside of the room as other college students are coming in to do their experiment. And I'm like, here's your extra credit form. Thank you for coming in. There will be no study today. And then a couple of weeks later, somebody actually broke into the room and stole the projector. You can't really run my study without a projector. So once again, standing in the room, handing out extra credit, and once again, no data collected. So sometimes it's fun to collect data, and other times it is very much a Murphy's Law situation. So with the 20 minutes or so that we have left, I would like to spend some more time talking about learning and conditioning. And once again, not the kind of conditioning that you do to your hair, although conditioning your hair is very important. Yeah, Jules.
I'm so sorry, this is off topic, but on the Friday, it says that the exam next week is on a Tuesday.
That is probably incorrect. It should be on the 20th, which is a Wednesday.
Okay.
Yeah, I have to change that date. That probably rolled over from last time, and it is not online, so I'll go ahead and fix that this afternoon. I have written your exam. I will have the study guide up for you on Wednesday. I will probably be working on it this afternoon. Hopefully, it should be a little easier than last time, and fingers crossed that we are not in the dark. That would be nice. This is the only building on campus that doesn't have window access. Like, it's weird to me. Okay, so let's talk a little bit. So the last time we were here, we were talking about the basic steps in classical conditioning. And so I'm going to run through these one more time because we haven't talked about this in about 5 days because our last class was on Wednesday. We didn't have class on Friday. So I want to make sure that this is nice and cemented in your head, because at least for learning and conditioning, this can be one of the trickier things. So we're going to go back to our very famous example of Pavlov's dog. So we're going to start with what we call an unconditioned stimulus. So an unconditioned stimulus is a stimulus that produces an unlearned, reflexive, instinctive response. You put food in a dog's mouth, and the dog will begin the unconditioned response of drooling or salivating. Now, let's be very, very clear about this. Nobody taught that dog to salivate. This is something that a dog does instinctually. Likewise, if I shoot a puff of air into your eye, you're going to blink it closed. Nobody taught you how to do that. It is a reflex that you basically use to protect yourself. On the other hand, if I play a tone or I sound a bell, what we're going to find is that no salivation occurs. This is a neutral stimulus, and on its own, nothing happens. So then, this is all before conditioning. During conditioning, I am going to pair that neutral stimulus with my unconditioned stimulus. So we're going to pair the tone with food in the dog's mouth. So we're going to pair that neutral stimulus with our unconditioned stimulus. And that's going to produce salivation. So what's really critical here is that the neutral stimulus has to come first. It has to predict that the meat is about to appear. Sort of like if my dog hears his a bag rattling, he needs to know that that's about to predict the arrival of food in his bowl. Same sort of idea. So it needs to be predictive. If I pair that neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus long enough, what will happen is that eventually the tone on its own, which has now become a conditioned stimulus, is sufficient to produce a salivation response. But in this case, you're salivating to the tone, which previously did nothing on its own. So now we have our conditioned stimulus that has produced a conditioned or learned response. The dog had to learn how to do this rather than it being instinctive and reflexive. So that's a nice little review for what we're going to talk about next. So what is critical for forming that conditioned stimulus conditioned response relationship? So first of all, as I talked about, we need a stimulus, like an unconditioned stimulus, that produces a reflexive response, an unconditioned response. So an example is an air puff to the eye. And as we talked about last time, I am the only person in this room that enjoys the air puff test. It makes me giggle. Now, here's what's really critical. The response that you see to the unconditioned stimulus and the conditioned stimulus are going to be exactly the same. But what they are responding to is going to be different. So in the case of if I pair a tone with an air puff and the tone always comes before that air puff, I'm going to start blinking in response to the tone, just as I blink in response to the air puff. The difference is that with my conditioned response, I'm blinking to the tone. With the unconditioned response, I'm blinking reflexively to that air puff. Okay, everybody good, or does anybody need some more time? Okay, Jules. Okay, everybody good now? So we're going to talk about 3 different phenomena that are associated with classical conditioning. Well, actually, we have more than 3, but we actually have 4, actually 5. I can't count today. But they're 3 bullet points, so you can kind of see why I did that. So we're going to talk about acquisition, which is basically what we just talked about. That's basically making that neutral stimulus into a conditioned stimulus. So we'll talk some more about acquisition. Then we'll talk about something called extinction, along with spontaneous recovery. And then we'll finish up by talking about generalization and discrimination. And I am not talking about the kind of discrimination that you sometimes do to people who are different than you. We are talking about discrimination as in being able to discriminate and notice differences in different types of stimuli. So we're going to talk about each of these in greater detail on the next sets of slides. So acquisition is what we typically talk about when we talk about learning and conditioning with classical conditioning. This is when we begin to form that association between our conditioned stimulus and our unconditioned stimulus. So here's the thing. When you're pairing a neutral stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus to basically produce a conditioned stimulus with a conditioned response, timing and order matter. The conditioned stimulus needs to predict the arrival of the unconditioned stimulus. So first of all, we always want our conditioned stimulus to occur first. It needs to occur first. If it occurs at the same time as the unconditioned stimulus, you're not going to get as strong conditioning. It's not as predictive. If it's in backwards order, where the unconditioned stimulus comes first and then the conditioned stimulus, it's not going to work. So if you present the tone and the meat at the same time, you're not going to get as strong of an effect. And if you present the meat first and then the tone, well, the tone doesn't predict anything at that point. So we need to make sure that our meat comes second and our tone always comes first. It needs to predict something. The other thing that matters in addition to the order is the timing. You need to make sure that there is not too long of a delay between your conditioned stimulus and your unconditioned stimulus. You can't sound a tone and then give the meat 10 minutes later. There's no relationship there. You want it to be, if possible, less than a second between your tone and your meat to get the strongest conditioning. So here's what we're going to see. When we start pairing our conditioned stimulus and our unconditioned stimulus, at least initially, our conditioned response, salivating in response to the tone, is going to be pretty weak. But over time, the more that we pair these together, we will start to get a stronger conditioned response. When you see that the conditioned stimulus has produced a very strong conditioned response, you can say that you have acquired the conditioned response. You now have a very strong association between your conditioned stimulus and your unconditioned stimulus. So now I have a question for you. So Pavlov's dog salivating to the tone is contingent upon pairing the tone with that meat. What happens if I only present the tone and I stop pairing it with meat? What's going to happen to the drooling to the tone? It's going to go away. Exactly. And this is a phenomenon known as extinction. So if we only present the tone, but we no longer present the food with it, so we don't pair our unconditioned stimulus with our conditioned stimulus, you can actually see the conditioned response weaken. So when the conditioned stimulus, like our tone, is presented on its own, eventually salivating in response to our tone will cease. So the conditioned response will eventually disappear, as Michelle said. Now, here's my question though. Have I erased the learning? Who says I have completely erased the learning? Who says I have not erased the learning? Who says I don't know, Dr. Gilchrist, just tell me the answer? That is okay too. So it turns out when we do this extinction process, we haven't erased our learning, we have only temporarily inhibited it. How do we know this? We know this because of something called spontaneous recovery. Everybody good? You need a little more time? Okay. So has the learning been erased? So here's what we find. If you give the animal a break, so if we're in a Pavlov situation where we've been pairing a tone with meat, and then we present the tone on its own, and we extinguish that conditioned response, what we can do is we can take the dog out of the laboratory environment for maybe about a day. Then we bring them back into the lab, and we introduce the tone again. And almost like magic, all of a sudden, we actually see a reappearance of the conditioned response, even though we haven't paired it with meat. So this is what is referred to as spontaneous recovery. So spontaneous recovery shows that we haven't actually erased the response. It's still there. If we take a brief pause, it will come back. But what I hope you notice is that in this instance, notice that the conditioned response is not as strong as it once was at the height of acquisition. So it has been diminished a little bit, but we haven't actually erased any of that learning. We have only inhibited it. If we want to change the learning, we may have to go through multiple periods of extinction to ensure that the response is actually gone, or we may need to counter condition and basically condition somebody to behave in the opposite way. So I've mostly been talking about this conditioning with respect to training a dog to salivate to a tone. But as we're going to see, and I think I'm going to have to cover this in our video, you can actually use the principles of classical conditioning to create fear. Please use your powers for good and not for evil. I'm going to share with you on video a study, and I'm going to preface it like I do many of these with the idea we probably couldn't do this today, but we're going to talk about some of the work of John Watson. He and his graduate student basically created fear of a rat in an infant who had previously not been afraid of rats. And so you can actually use some of these principles to actually create larger behavioral change than salivating to a tone. So here's what's interesting. What we do find is that if I present a dog with a tone that is pretty similar to the original tone they were trained with, the dog will drool to a similar tone. And this is what is known as generalization. So one of the ways that Pavlov actually looked at this was by pinching different parts of a dog. So same sort of idea as when we did this with tones. He would pinch a dog on the thigh and then would give him meat. So the idea here is that our conditioned stimulus is a pinch on the thigh, and then that is immediately paired with meat. So the dog would start to drool if you pinched it on the thigh. So we get a conditioned response here. Then, based on what Pavlov did, so he measured the drops of saliva and he would pinch different areas of the dog after acquisition to see how much of a salivation response that he got. And here's what's kind of interesting. Areas that are near where the dog was initially trained, the thigh, produce the strongest response. But what's interesting is you still get a pretty high response at areas that are near the thigh, especially areas like the pelvis. So as we kind of get closer to that original area that was trained, we get a stronger response. As we move farther away from the thigh, including the front paw, the foreleg, and the shoulder, we get less and less of a salivation response. So sometimes, because stimuli are similar to each other, we will find that they generalize. Okay, we'll do one more slide. Just one more. We'll talk about discrimination and then we'll be done for the day. And look for an email from me for a link to today's recording and also an additional video. I'll try not to make it longer than 20 minutes. So it'll be another quick one for you. So try to watch that by Wednesday if you can. Okay, so discrimination is basically when one stimulus differs from the conditioned stimulus enough that one will produce a salivation response and the other one will not. So discrimination is when we are able to effectively differentiate between two different stimuli. So I train a dog with a 256 hertz tone, and that produces salivation. If I have a 392 hertz tone, which is different enough, that will produce no salivation. So these stimuli are different enough from each other that one will produce the conditioned response and the other one will not. Only one of them will be associated with the unconditioned stimulus. So be able to differentiate between acquisition, extinction, spontaneous recovery, generalization, and discrimination. You should be in pretty good shape if you can think of examples of each of these for the exam. All right, that is all I had. It's about 10:50, so we are pretty much done, and I will see you all on Wednesday. Check your emails from me today.